Welcome to Sopra Steria Insights. On this podcast, we dive into the world of technology and transformation, fueled by insights from top industry experts. Today, we're kicking off our AI series. We all know AI is a hot topic, not without its complexities, so we'll focus on key themes to help us unpack it. Today, it's data, what you could call the lifeblood of AI. We're joined by our head of data and AI consulting at Sopra Steria Next, Susannah Matschke, and Simon Baxter, Principal Analyst at TechMarketView. Welcome to you both, Susannah and Simon. Let's kick things off with the fundamentals. So AI is nothing without data. I think it's fair to say that. Susannah, would you agree?
Yes, I definitely agree with that one. I think sometimes with the hype around AI at the minute, a lot of people's first interactions with AI can be things like ChatGPT, and then people forget that really it's all based on data. And as you say, without data, there is no AI.
And Simon, have you got a view on that?
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think the importance of having not just large quantities of data, but high quality data to AI is really critical. To really ensure that those, the outputs that businesses are generating are kind of useful and accurate. So, absolutely, data comes in a lot of different forms, which kind of makes it difficult to kind of give a blanket statement. But certainly, having a really useful multiple sources of data, internal, external, is critical for AI.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that comes back to data being considered the fuel for AI. And Susannah, as our resident expert in Sopra Steria Next on data, what is that connection between the data and AI models, just in simple terms?
I think, as you point out, that data is often called the fuel for AI, and that's because it powers the AI models that we use. It's often referred to as well as oil or gold. You quite often hear data referred to as either of those two things, which I think is interesting because they're both finite resources that need to be refined in order to get something valuable out of them, and that's where the connection comes from. But really, when we think about it, data isn't a finite resource. We're constantly producing more data, and it's within the control of each organization to produce more data. But the more data that you have, the better quality that it is, the more you can feed into those AI systems, the better it becomes, and the more valuable the outputs you'll get out of those as well. So without data, AI would be like a car without fuel. It would be unable to operate or learn effectively.
Thanks, Susannah. And from your view, Simon, obviously being in that privileged position of an industry-wide analyst, I guess you're seeing this fuel and focus on data right across the various industries and sectors. Are there any differences across the sectors, do you see, or is this a common challenge?
I mean, there certainly are lots of differences across industries. I think just like coming from a slightly different perspective, I think when we think about the large language models like GPT, they've been trained on billions of kind of data points, or in trillions of data points and terabytes of data. When we think about all of that data in the web that it's been trained on, not all of that is necessarily useful. So it's created these effective models, but you wouldn't want to base medical knowledge on Wikipedia, for example, and you don't want your chatbot trained on the language of Reddit. So you've got to, this often when we were looking at LMs initially, they've often been referred to as foundation models, right, as well, which they do serve as this great foundation for building more contextual AI on top of. But that's where we start getting into the industry. So going, well, you can take these LLMs, whether that's models from GPT or Anthropic or Google, but you've got to then turn them into something useful. And that means you've got to look at industry-specific contextual data, whether that's in healthcare or retail or logistics, and think of all those sources that data is going to come from. It can be from kind of the traditional measures from your kind of back-end systems. It can be from your customer conversations, from your agents, or it can even be things from IoT devices, from vehicles, from manufacturing machinery. It's such a wide spectrum that I think that the key for me, and maybe get onto that a bit more in a moment, is it's all about context when it comes to data.
I think that's a really interesting point, which I agree, Simon. We will no doubt touch on as part of this conversation. But I'm really interested. You talk about that explosion of data and the multiple sources that can come from, and I really do love that comparison of not wanting Reddit to be fitting the language of your large language model, for example, right? It is about that appropriateness and everything else. But that explosion of data in particular. How has that changed the landscape for AI development? I mean, there's been obviously quite a lot of focus around large language, but there's now also quite a lot of generative AI out there in widespread use. How's that changed things, Susannah, in your mind?
I think, as Simon says, the term explosion is the right one. And there's always been a lot of data around all the systems and applications that we use to generate data. I'm sure people with legacy estates know how much data that they've got there. I think really it's become more easily accessible, or we're getting better at understanding how to access that data and how to improve the data that we already have. So making sure it's of a high quality, that there's data standards in place, that it's complete. And then also, as Simon pointed out, there's lots of new ways of receiving data as well, from wearables and different interactions and things like that. And it's that explosion that's really helped to support the amount of AI that we see nowadays. So the more data there is, the more we can use to train AI models. The more data you have to train, the more accurate the outputs are likely to be from that as well. Large data sets have really enabled AI systems to tackle more sophisticated problems, from natural language processing to computer vision. For instance, deep learning models, which excel in fields like image recognition or language translation, they require vast amounts of data to reach their full potential. You can build models with minimal data, but the chances are that it won't have learned enough to give you accurate and reliable outputs. So really, the more you put in and the better quality it is, the better outputs you'll be getting out of those. So certainly without the explosion of data, the AI advancements we see today would not have been possible.
And Simon, have you anything you would like to add to that from a...
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of want to echo Susannah's point, because I was going to sort of have something sound similar, which was that, yes, there is this kind of explosion of data, more so in some areas than others. And, there's been certain quotes out there that, it's kind of doubling or tripling every year, 18 months. I think that depends a lot on the type of data that it is. I think what's kind of interesting when you look at how AI is being applied right now, it is really about unlocking that existing data that Susannah mentioned. So businesses already had huge amounts of data that, the quantity of data has not been a problem. The problem is it's been locked up in siloed. It's been either knowledge in people's heads. It's been in disparate systems. So actually, a lot of AI now is about unlocking the value of the data in those systems and helping organizations to understand actually what they do have, because it can be quite difficult to know across your entire enterprise what data you even have. What exists across all those different systems. So unlocking those silos and unlocking that access to data, it's going to require really concerted effort. It's not something you can do kind of very piecemeal. So yeah, I think, again, come back to my earlier point, there is huge amounts of data, particularly very specific quality data is what a lot of businesses are now trying to really unlock in their businesses.
Yeah, that's a really hot topic there, Simon, I think. And I'm sure Susannah has a few opinions on that, it's fair to say. But that quality of data, I mean, particularly looking at the disparate sources that you talk about, the fact that this data is already existing within organizations, and in many cases, organizations really struggling to find how to tap into that. They can see the potential of AI, and particularly some of the newer advances that we've seen around visual AI in particular, etc. But Susannah, I would love to hear your views on the quality of data and how that affects the performance and accuracy of the models.
Absolutely, Tom. There's the saying, rubbish in, rubbish out, and that's certainly true of AI models. If the data that you're putting in and using to build them isn't of good quality, then what you're going to get out is really probably not what you're looking for. It's not going to be reliable. It's not going to be insightful. You're not going to be able to base any business decisions on that. So although it's really a difficult thing to do, to look at your data quality and look at how you can improve it, it can be a monotonous task. It can be very time consuming, but really, if you want high quality outputs from your data, you need to put in the difficult work up front and put in the time up front and invest in improving the quality of that data, because it directly influences the model performance. If your data is accurate, if it's complete, well represented, if you have standards in place, and if you have done the work to make sure that it's fair and unbiased as well, what you'll get out is something that's far higher quality than if you use poor data, noisy data, incomplete data sets. And this can be difficult because often we're asking questions of the data that it wasn't created for in the first place. So systems record data as you move through them, and that might not be what it was created around in the first place, the questions you're now asking of it. So you're quite likely to find that the data that you have maybe doesn't tell the full story. But I would always encourage people to lead with the business problems and the questions that they're asking from it, not from what can you get out of the data, but what do you need from the data, and then move on from there.
And that you touch on something there as well, Susannah, which is really quite interesting around incomplete data. It's not just an accuracy issue, or even perhaps biased data, which is something we will be covering in depth in another session in this series around the ethics and bias within data and how that impacts AI. But how can those issues, as a data practitioner, how can those issues be mitigated in this new AI world that we're in?
There's lots of different things that people can do. There's different techniques to look at. So if you can look at where the data has been generated from and how it's been generated, you can really get under the hood of that data itself. So if you understand the points at which it's been generated and what questions have been asked to get that data, then you can start to unpick a bit more about the quality of it and the completeness of it. And you can also look at what I think is really important is pulling together data sources from different systems within your organization. So if you're reporting solely on one system or one application, say your accounting system, then you'll get a view of what's happening from that system, but you won't understand what's happening across the rest of the organization. So you won't necessarily see the full picture in relation to, say, your project management software or your inventory management software. What you need to do is to put in the work to create a data model that links together all of these core factors within your business. It's something that we call a common data model. And that allows for more complete reporting. And it's also a really good way of checking the quality of your data, as we discussed earlier. So is it complete? Are there any duplicates? What can you do to improve the data? And sometimes, if there is missing or very difficult to use data, there needs to be decisions that can be made on whether you move forward from that point in time where you can start improving the data, or whether you put in the work to improve that. So do you kind of write it off and look more forward thinking, or do you put in the work to improve that historical data, and what's going to be most valuable for you and your business?
So that is so interesting, because that really brings, Susannah, into sharp focus the kind of need for what we know we should have been doing for quite some time around solid data governance, knowing what you have, where it is, where it resides, what you can be doing with it, where it's stored, etc. And that common data model approach fits so well within what's been talked about for many years around enterprise architecture and data governance and all of those things. But AI is really shining a light on that at the moment, I believe. And Simon, in your experience and kind of having that pan industry view, is this something that you see is being adopted, this common data model approach?
I'm not sure necessarily a common data model. I mean, I think it varies a lot by industry. I think we have to think about the maturity of different businesses and different industries, where they're at in their data journey. I think if we look at areas like financial services, for example, they've been quite advanced in their use of AI. They've been building machine learning models, analytics models for some time. I think where we look at areas like healthcare and local government, they're a bit more behind the curve in terms of having to bring together these disparate systems, as Susannah said. I mean, when we think about healthcare and the NHS and all the different trusts, for example, how do they share data, how they integrate different systems, that continues to be a real challenge. I think, for me, the focus is that I see from my conversations with organizations is about folks is where they can get data that is specific to particular parts of their business, and how they can then refine those LLMs. So I read a piece recently talking about how the pace of LLM innovation is slowing. We've seen that OpenAI's next model, Orion, is going to be a much smaller leap than what we saw from GPT-3 to 4. What that means is it's now less about how we can exploit these huge LLMs and how we can take them and refine them down to the context of HR or to legal or accounting. And a lot of tech suppliers out there at the minute are building solutions that will help organizations in those areas, that is taking that domain expertise and building engines and platforms and AI accelerators that can really focus that data and that expertise into a specific job role and particular function. I think that's what I'm really seeing in a minute. That there is also, Tom, a lot of work going kind of in that to build that foundation, to build that data foundation and cloud foundation that organizations really need to get the most of AI. And actually, there's a lot. That's where a lot of attention right now is also going, as well as just building that AI application layer on top.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point about the large language models and the advancements. We're seeing that slow, and there has been coverage in the last couple of weeks, actually conflicting coverage, which Susannah, I'd love your view on, of we're hitting a wall with the advancements of this, and then the very next day, something conflicting saying that we're not, things will continue to progress. But it does feel like actually the technology can really only take you so far. It's there's a point where you need to look within your own organization to see how you can reap the benefits of AI. Susannah, have you a view on that?
Yeah, I think what I've certainly seen a lot of recently in speaking to clients is what we're calling a POC paralysis, a proof of concept paralysis, where organizations have gone out and seen the latest and greatest in AI technologies and purchased it and hoped to integrate it into their business. And they see that they're trying to use these new technologies, but they're not really getting anywhere, not getting out of that proof of concept or pilot phase. And there's a few reasons for this. The main one, I think, being that we're leading here with technology and with solutions. We're not leading with problems. What we need to focus on is the users and understanding the people. Any technology that's introduced into an organization should be introduced to make people's lives easier. At the end of the day, it should help people to be better at their jobs, to be better for their customers, to provide better outcomes. But if we're purchasing technology first and then trying to fit it into the problem, we're kind of coming at the problem backwards. If you take the time to understand your users, whoever that might be, whether that's internal users or external users, and sit with them and understand what their day looks like, what their frustrations are, what repetitive processes they might have to do, then we can start to formulate what the problem might be and then look at the best technology to suit that problem. And that really helps lift out of the proof of concept paralysis phase, because it means you have a purpose, you have business value attached to the technology, and you have an outcome in mind. And it makes it much more measurable so you can see whether or not it's going to be a success.
Yes, and I think I'm brought back to just something you said there, brings me back to something I heard Simon say probably well over a year ago, that AI really is a proxy for digital transformation. I've stolen that phrase, Simon. I use it extensively, so thank you for that. But it really does feel like that rigor of business-led change and not doing the technology proof of concepts just for the sake of the technology proof of concepts is where we'll be able to see the real impact and business benefit that you talk about. Because quite often in Sopra Steria we talk about the value of empowering the human, and I think when we look at that in the context of AI, it really does be back to the really fundamental principles yet again of user-centered design, looking at the user journeys and looking at how we can actually join things up to unlock some of those transformational benefits, Simon, that I think you're referring to when you talk about that. And sorry to put you on the spot, Simon, but hopefully you remember making that comment at a conference. But it was that concept of it being a proxy for transformation. Do you think that's still relevant today with all of the advancements we've seen?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's certainly necessarily the next phase, I guess, of the digital transformation kind of conversation. I think AI, particularly the LLMs and through natural language, is enabling so much better access to information and to the data that organizations hold across different systems. That's really, when you look at the majority of AI use cases we're seeing right now, so much of it is really focused on knowledge management, knowledge recall, being able to pull that information in, whether that's for, say, back end kind of teams and systems, or whether that's for kind of customer agents. But I think the mistake that some organizations have had, particularly early on in the AI journey, was trying to leap ahead quite quickly. Trying to say, well, we want to invest in AI, we want to do something with AI. And that's not necessarily always the right answer, because again, it comes back to that: how mature are you as an organization on your kind of digital transformation or data journey, however you want to position it. There's a lot of foundations that you need to have to really exploit AI. And yes, you could just go and quite easily these days build a chatbot or a customer agent, but is it really going to deliver that context and nuance to your business, to your particular industry? I think what a lot of businesses have found with those pilots that Susannah mentioned is actually, no, it wasn't. It wasn't a step far enough. It wasn't having enough context, and they needed to really train it on their business's data, the expertise their staff have. And that's why we've seen so much focus really on the whole augmentation aspect of AI right now. It's all about how we augment people's roles, at least for now, and how you can use data and AI and machine learning and natural language to enhance what people are doing, how they access information, how they can converse with their customers, how they can enable their own organization to have better access to internal documents and information.
Which actually is a perfect segue into the next point I wanted to make, because that pressure on the heads of DDAT or on the CIOs out there to actually from the rest of the business actually to show benefits from AI. What are we doing about AI in our business? That could generate some significant risk, I guess, both operational but also from an ethical perspective, perhaps around data privacy and security, because all of that data, which is the fuel or the oil for the AI, needs to sit somewhere. And there is a real risk here that there could be some of those privacy and security concerns. Susannah, have you got a view on that?
I think, yeah, that's a great point, Tom. There's certainly a lot of concerns around the privacy and the security of data. And I think quite often when I'm speaking to clients, that's something that a lot of people feel holds them back. There's that universal fear of being on the front page of the newspaper because you've done something that you shouldn't have with your data, right? And whilst it's a very valid concern and a very serious thing that needs to be taken seriously and given due attention, we shouldn't let these things necessarily hold us back from seeing what can be done with data. It's really important to put in the time to understand the policies that we've got in place, how we are handling the secure data. We need to be mindful that this represents a person at the end of the day, and that they have a right to privacy and to anonymity if that's how it's been collected. So, and organizations really need to put in place the processes to ensure that they're taking care of the data in the way that they should be. Data privacy and compliance, so balancing AI needs with legal requirements, things like GDPR, obviously, and the other regulations that are in place, and understanding the retention policies as well is very important, who can access the data, and what decisions are being made as a result of this data. But we also need to look at how the algorithms themselves are built, because if they're trained on a certain type of data, say from only one demographic, it then won't know how to handle data from a more diverse demographic if it has never received that sort of data. There's been well publicized cases out there of CV readers that are only trained on men's CVs, for instance. So then when they receive a woman's CV, they think it doesn't fit the bill of what it's been asked to look at, because it just doesn't look like what it's been trained on. So there's lots of tales of caution out there, I think, that can be used. But really, it's about getting those policies and procedures in place that best suit your organization and meet the needs of the data that you're holding.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think we've all heard some of those examples of where there have been challenges, particularly around of the implementation of some of the models. And for you, Simon, in terms of looking across the industries, are there any particular areas where data management and collection practices are more challenging in the context of AI, or are there any particular organizations or industries that do it better?
I think there are certainly areas where it can be more challenging. I think, areas that are industries that are highly regulated, and healthcare in particular is one that is greatly struggling with this. Financial services as well to a large extent, but anywhere that you've got high amount of regulations that you have to meet, and where you've got very sensitive data, you've got to have some very clear guidelines and frameworks that are going to support that. I think, just to kind of like diverge slightly, I think what underpinning all this is you can build all the best ethical framework and guidelines that you want, but you've got to have that fundamental data security as well in place. And I think when organizations are going ahead and building AI applications, I think security has to go hand in hand in that, because when we look, with that kind of from that cybersecurity aspect, all the kind of threat actors out there are trying to do is to extort you, steal the data and extort your business. So that's got to be at the foundation. Is you've got to have strong data security. You've got to be able to secure access to all the various applications, suppliers, third parties that are using it, and then building all these, the ethical considerations on the other technology aspects on top of that.
Yeah, and again, reinforcing that point of it comes back to fundamentals each time. This may be a new technology set, advancement of how we might drive technology to give us those empowerments for the humans that we talk about, but actually the fundamental principles of solid governance and control really do come into play each time. Well, believe it or not, Simon, Susannah, we're nearing the end of the podcast. But I have one final question for you both before we do wrap up. And it was particularly in relation to data and AI. Do we think it will continue to evolve in terms of the way that we manage our data? Will it remain central, or would it become less reliant on very large data sets? Do we see a change of direction of those things, Susannah, on the horizon?
I think data will always be fundamental to AI. If you really get under the hood of what AI is, it's a series of algorithms, it's probabilities and statistics at the end of the day. So without data, that simply wouldn't exist. I think even whilst AI models are becoming more advanced, data will still remain central to those. Even with more sophisticated algorithms, models still need data to learn and adapt to new environments. In the future, we might see that AI relies more on smaller, more high quality data sets, perhaps as we become more advanced and iterate on existing models, or use methods more like unsupervised learning or reinforcement learning, which will reduce the dependency so much on the large labeled data sets. We've moved more towards the unlabeled data sets, but I think data will always be essential for AI's adaptability and accuracy. And at the end of the day, really, we need to know what's going in order to know if we can trust what's coming out.
Brilliant. Thank you, Susannah. And Simon, rather unfairly, same question to you, trying to follow Susannah, a data specialist. Any views on the future of data models?
Well, I completely agree that I think we're going to see a trend towards certainly more refined models, probably smaller language models, which are certainly already starting to be much more widely used. And again, I think organizations are going to just have to think about what data they have and how they train different models. I'll kind of leave kind of my last point on something a bit different, is that, one of the trends that we're seeing start to pick up is around the use of things like synthetic data. So, in particular areas that are, highly regulated, as we've kind of talked about, actually being able to use synthetic data to train your models, being able to kind of experiment with different scenarios, overcoming some of those kind of issues of like availability and access and quality and privacy to an extent. I think that is something, it's still early days, but there's a couple of the suppliers already that are starting to explore the use of synthetic data. So I think we'll start to see different approaches to how organizations train models and how they then put them into production.
That's so interesting. Machine generated data feeding the machine model, right? So it becomes a virtuous circle potentially there. It could be one to watch, I guess, with great interest in terms of how that advances things, and maybe it does overcome that LLM hitting the wall fear that's been floated most recently. Simon, Susannah, thank you very much both for your time today on this latest Sopra Steria Insight podcast. Thank you for your participation, for your conversation, and I look forward to speaking to you both soon.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.